Hi, this is Colin Richards, president and founder of Lord & Richards. And today we're going to continue our series on what is different about Lord & Richards. Why might you come to us as opposed to another financial professional? And we've talked about in other videos the nature of our comprehensive planning process, which is not only unique, the Financial Independence Review, but it's also very seldom that you encounter a financial advisor or planner who will get you a written plan in all the key areas, whether that's tax and estate planning, risk management, income planning, or planning for chronic illness. In addition, we've talked about our philosophy that is a little bit different. We have a philosophy that you should put money according to its purpose in the right investments to achieve that purpose. So the purpose of money dictates where you put it. And we've talked about the three kinds of money: short-term, growing reserve, and protected money, that are vital to achieve different purposes for retirees, and how all three are necessary if you want to be able to call yourself financially independent. Well, today we're going to be talking about what it means to come in and have a visit and what the financial review process looks like, the Financial Independence Review at Lord & Richards. So I'm going to once again divide up our screen here. And this time, instead of drawing, I'm going to show you a sample of what a review looks like with the Lord & Richards team. So the first thing that happens, of course, is we meet together here in our offices. We get together and talk about your goals and your concerns, those different key areas of financial planning, and what is most important to you about all of those. And then when we meet together, we conduct a review where we're going to do some tests. So we gather some information from you in that first visit. We learn more about your portfolio and get your statements. We get a copy of your budget. That's real important. Between our first and second appointment, we're going to take that budget and we're going to enter your information into some critical planning software. We're going to conduct scientific tests to help you determine, am I financially independent or on the road to financial independence? And we're going to talk about what those tests look like here in just a moment. So the first thing that we're going to do as part of that review is we're going to go through your goals. And our agenda begins with understanding those four key areas of financial planning. And we're going to touch on all of those from the perspective of your goals. So here's an example of John and Betty Sample's goals, and they had retirement goals that might look very similar to yours or be radically different. They happen to be people of faith, so they wanted to do mission work and those kinds of things. They had a goal to be with the grandkids. They needed to get their wills and trusts redone, and on it goes. They were a pretty conservative couple. They weren't really looking for a lot of risk. Now, we work with people all over the goal spectrum. So wherever you are, we want to first find out in our investment risk review, review number 1, where you stand. And so John and Betty had what I would call a very typical retirement portfolio. Again, we don't have a size expectation, but this is where they were. And in reality, their budget and their portfolio and other income sources looked on first blush to be in alignment. So they had a tidy little nest egg of about $1.3 million composed of IRAs and other types of vehicles. Their breakout of assets was pretty typical as well for somebody on the doorstep of retirement. They had been accumulating money. They had been following the rules. They had invested in their 401k and 403b. And so clearly they had a majority of the money over here in the stock market. Money was primarily in the stock market, 60%. We understand that stocks traditionally represent risk, right? You go out and buy a company. That's what stock is, ownership in a company. You're going to be there to participate both in its upside and downside. Bonds are different. They're a loan. They're often considered a little bit more secure, a little bit more stable, a little bit more conservative. But let me just say this, bonds as well have risk. During the commonly referred to collapse in 2008, 2009, bonds went down just like everything else. So it's not a safe haven. It's just a different kind of investment with traditionally a little bit lower returns than stocks and a little bit less risk. So 77% of their assets were in what we would call at-risk investments. They also had cash and some other things that didn't fit into these categories. So looking at that, you would think that perhaps John and Betty felt pretty comfortable with risk. This was their first review, investment risk review, and this is their first chance to really see where they stood. So the first thing we wanted to do with them was conduct a little exercise. I sometimes jokingly refer to this as the pyramid of doom, but it also is the pyramid of opportunity. You can see down the left-hand side over here that we've got portfolio A through G. They're all available as fake portfolios for this exercise. They're not real portfolios. They were invented to create the environment or the circumstances where folks could express to us how they feel about risk. And isn't it great to be able to actually sit down and have a conversation with someone about risk and how you feel about that and put it into real concrete terms? So we're going to put it into dollars, not just percentages. Let me show you how the game or the exercise works. So this first area, portfolio A, you'll notice it has a pretty low downside. That's the left side. And on the right side, it has a pretty low upside. So it'd be kind of like owning treasuries or something like that. 1% growth in a year with maybe a 0% downside risk, super conservative. Down here in the middle is portfolio D, and we can see there I've made it very tempting. It's got a 10% upside. So 10% growth potentially or 10% downside. Remember, our parameters are what might happen over the next year. And so here's the question, is if you were in portfolio G over the next year and you had the opportunity to potentially earn up to 35% in growth, wow, that'd be great. But you could also lose 35%. So it's kind of a coin toss. Heads you win, tails you lose. How would you feel about being in that portfolio if you were on the losing side? We all know we would feel fantastic on the growth side, on the green side. But if this was a losing year, how would it feel to lose 35%? Now, before you answer that question, let me add a couple more rules to the game. For our engineers out there, our mathematically minded, first of all, remember, they're not real portfolios. Okay, so they're not based on any particular mix of stocks, bonds. The purpose of this is to set up the circumstances where you can recreate the feeling of what it's like to lose money in a market downturn, and where you can share with us your risk tolerance is. We call it your uncle point. Another thing to remember is this is not about how much you could survive. You know, my father served our country in the Vietnam War. My father also served as law enforcement. He earned 2 separate full pensions. So my dad has his daily living and his expenses and his budget more than taken care of. He's widowed, and so his financial needs are met. So you might say, well, I could take all kinds of risks because I'm not worried about being able to cover my needs. That's what we call risk capacity. How much risk could you take and be okay? How much risk could you take and be okay? That's risk capacity. And we have another exercise for that. That's math. This is emotion. How would you feel having worked as long as you have, or maybe you've inherited some, or whatever it was that got you where you were and are today? How would you feel if you were on the losing side of one of these portfolios and saw that money disappear? Oh yes, I know there'll be opportunity to recover, but remember, as a retiree, those opportunities are being pulled down because of the withdrawals you make off your own portfolio. So it's much harder to recover when you're already retired or you're nearing retirement. Well, John and Betty, you'll see some initials in those boxes. I gave them each opportunity. I usually do ladies first for our married couples. And they both expressed a really conservative view. Not everybody I talk to is this conservative. But Betty said literally, Colin, I'm at a point where I don't want to lose any money. Is there any way we can do that? Well, of course, I explained that's really hard to do and get everything else you want. You want some liquidity, you want growth, you want safety. You remember from our little exercise in our first or our second video on 3 kinds of money that you usually have to pick one thing to compromise. John was willing to give a little bit more, and he said portfolio B. By the way, this is an actual client. I've just changed the names. Okay, so these are real people. Well, I've had other clients say, Colin, I could go down to G. You know, I could take that kind of risk. So I've got folks all over the map. And the question I'll ask you if we have the opportunity to sit down is, where would your uncle point be? You know, when I grew up with siblings, they would wrestle and this kind of thing. And Sometimes you get in that little position where they say, uncle, twist your arm. Well, where would you say, I could go about that far, but I wouldn't feel comfortable going past it? That's your uncle point. I have a lot of people say C or D or E, okay, wherever that is. So we know where John and Betty was. Now we're going to bring the test results, and I want to explain to you what you're about to see on screen. You're going to see a snip of a road, asphalt, with a yellow line going down. On the right side of that road is going to be the average return when we take your portfolio, we bundle it up, and we back test it over the last several decades. We see what would your portfolio have done if you owned the same stuff. Now we know you own different things 10, 20, 30 years ago, but what we're trying to do is get an idea. What if you own these same investments going forward and we repeat history? Is that possible? Could we repeat history? Well, we see it all the time. What we learn from history is that we don't learn from history. And so we want to use the past not as a rule, but as a guide. And so looking in the past, we can see, well, there are market circumstances that we might encounter again. So the average return will be on the right side of the yellow line, in the right lane, and in the left line, you're going to see the worst year, or kind of what the real uncle point would be with this portfolio. So I'm going to bring us over here to John and Betty, and I'm going to zoom in a little bit here. Let me see if I can bring this down with my pointer. We're just going to scroll down and take a look at this portfolio. So let me explain again what you see. On the right side, it tells us that their portfolio of 60% stock and 17% bonds and so forth would have earned about 5.34% over the previous decades. So if we repeat history, that'd be a reasonable expectation. On the left side, we learned that in the worst of those bear markets that you would have encountered over those decades, they would have been down minus 27.6. Now, the first thing I'll note is that is certainly not the worst that I've seen. Almost every week I meet with somebody who has a minus 40. Okay? That's common because we saw our stock markets in 2008, 2009 drop by over 50%. So it's entirely possible that someone with a lot of stock would have a lot of risk like that. But the second thing we notice is, wow, that stock is probably the culprit here in them not achieving their risk goal of staying below a certain amount. So they're way past that, 10 times more risk than they should be taking. So guess what their view was? Hey, Colin, we need to make a change. We need to do something different here, and we need to start managing risk. And so remember that at Lord & Richards, we have three kinds of money. Short-term money that's kept safe and liquid, probably not much growth. Growing reserve, where we're going for it, we're going for the growth. It's kept liquid as well, but it's got risk, so we need to manage that risk. And then finally, protected money. And in their case, they had a short-term reserve, and they had money that was growing, albeit without risk management, but they didn't have any of that third kind of money, the protected. So in our next video in the series, what we're going to look at is what would it look like for Lord & Richards to come in and rebalance that and include protected money as well as risk management in the fourth column. I look forward to sharing that with you.